Right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for being here with us. My name is Siniša Vuković. I'm a professor here of conflict management. And it's a distinct privilege to welcome you to a very unique moment in 2 years of studying for a group that will present their capstone research. For those of you who don't know, this group traveled to the Philippines in the third week of March to study from up close the ongoing escalatory dynamics related to South China Sea, more concretely related to the West Philippine Sea, and try to figure out ways to think about potential de-escalatory or mitigating strategies as we speak. The trip is part of a capstone level course that these students were selected for. There was a vast pool of applicants, and these 16 students were selected as the most qualified and the most determined of the bunch. I had the privilege of taking them to the Philippines and guiding them through this process, supervising their research, and it's now really a pleasure to witness the culmination of this entire process that we have been conducting for more than 6 months. This is a moment to learn from our students, but up until this point, they were learning from a vast network of experts, both here in DC and in Manila. And prior to the trip, we were very lucky to have been exposed to the novel and policy relevant ideas of some of the most prominent experts in this domain. They spoke to us, they helped us understand the complexities of the situation at hand before we went to the trip. That process was also very helpful for the students to sophisticate and refine their topics before we were actually on the ground in Manila, before we could actually start talking to the key stakeholders. I would also like to recognize that in that process of organizing and setting up the trip, we had invaluable support and help from the U.S.-Philippine Society and their chairman, Hank Hendrickson, who is here with us. Thank you very much, Hank, for all your help. And DCM Ascalon from the Philippines Embassy, with whom we had countless conversations about what would be the best way to go and understand the situation at hand. You can understand that when we decided on the Philippines were just one of the many pieces of the puzzle in this very complex network of dynamics surrounding South China Sea. So most of our students, as you will see, looked at these dynamics from an asymmetric perspective. They tried to understand how a resourceless actor can mitigate the activities of a more assertive actor. But we did not dismiss the importance of the other side, especially when it comes to the Chinese behavior in South China Sea. So what you are going to hear is very nuanced, it's very refined, and it's also very comprehensive in scope. While we were in Manila, we had the opportunity to engage with a number of key stakeholders who are shaping, defining, designing, and implementing all of these policies as we speak. Our agenda was packed, our agenda was busy, but fortunately, it was very seamless to execute. I have to say that I'm impressed to see the conduct and the performance of our students while on this trip. It has been a remarkable enterprise. It has been a remarkable experience. And I really want to congratulate them for their conduct, for their performance, and especially, as you will see now, for their delivery of what their research has yielded after all these months. So the way we're going to proceed is we're going to hear from 4 presenters. Because we have 16 topics, each student decided independently what their research is going to be. We cannot, for the sake of time management, it's not easy if we have 16 separate presentations. So we have clustered these 16 presentations into 4 topics, 4 themes, and we have 4 designated presenters per theme. And each one will discuss their colleagues' also findings. After all of these presentations, we will move to a Q&A from the audiences, also from Zoom, if time allows, to hear what would you like to know more about what you have just heard from their presentations. So we have a good hour and a half in front of us to hear from our students and then engage in a fruitful, I hope, conversation with them. With that, thank you again very much for being with us. I would like to bring to the floor Matthew Dolan, who is going to present on behalf of the first group that has been focusing writ large on gray zone tactics and escalation management in South China Sea. Matt,
Thank you very much, Professor. As I get set up, I just want to check with Maggie. Do we need to let any more people in the waiting room on Zoom? Okay, good. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Matthew Dowden. I'll be presenting on behalf of the first of 4 groups this morning and this early afternoon. Our topics for our group are going to review the intersection of where gray zone tactics meet a modern deterrence theory. We're going to talk a little bit about both sides of the equation, talk to you about what the PRC is doing within the so-called gray zone, how the Philippines views that, and then also look at ways that the Philippines needs to or is looking to innovate from a perspective of modern deterrence. To get you guys there, we're going to start out with the PRC Maritime Militia, which is Bryony Whitlaw's piece. And then following Bryony, we're going to go into 2 pieces focused on the Filipino perspective. The first is from Idalis Mocoso, and we're going to talk to you about cyberspace operations, as well as evaluations of the Filipino cyberspace capabilities and vulnerabilities. I'll be reviewing my report on asymmetric maritime security solutions and where those fit into the puzzle. And then we'll close out with Georgi Kent's piece that reviews a bigger picture of where the Philippines sits in asymmetric deterrence profiles and what they need to do better as a nation in order to reach a proper deterrence. Welcome, Zoom admins. Okay, awesome. So as the first group, I'll take the liberty of setting a little bit of a picture and a scene for you, just to get you to the perspective of where the Filipinos are. Many of you see this or have heard of this region as the South China Sea. However, the Philippines, as you'll hear throughout the report, sees these as this area as the West Philippine Sea, because this is their sovereign territory and has been for decades. The island chain, as you can see on the right, is known in the Philippines as the Calayan Island Group. However, to many people, including many in the United States military and international partners abroad, we hear of this as the Spratly Islands. However, in the Philippines, the historic term is the Calayan Island Group, and it's a group of archipelagos of which they recognize which nations own which islands and have for some time. I'll leave the arbitration and the legal disputes about this for a later group. Okay, so what is the PRC doing? So as you can see in the top left, Filipino resupply missions being blocked by our PRC Coast Guard ship, they're actually colliding with that vessel. This is just one means of so-called gray zone tactics that the PRC is conducting in this region. However, they are also using lasers and water cannons to disrupt Filipino Coast Guard, Navy, and maritime vessels and fishing vessels. So on the bottom left, imagine that you're a Filipino sailor conducting peaceful mission, patrolling your own waters within your sovereign territory and or exclusive economic zone. And you run into a collision, a skirmish ensues, and you lose your thumb. Literally, it gets severed off. They were later able to reattach this sailor's thumb. However, for our group, I think Georgi's piece says it best in his opening line. The balance of this region hung in the air, and no one knew whether the Mutual Defense Treaty of 1951 between the Philippines and the United States would be enacted and a war would begin over something as simple as this. So deterrence is very important. And we're going to dive into that right now by focusing on what the PRC is doing beyond what you saw in this first slide with their maritime militia. So this is Bryony's piece. And I'm sorry, I think I misspelled with the Y. Apologies.
No, that's right.
That's right? Okay, good. So Bryony's conceptual framework of the maritime militia is to operationalize what the maritime militia is doing in the gray zone how that impacts the conflict continuum from escalatory or non-escalatory means, and then to utilize prospect theory to explain decision-making. And for those of you who don't know about prospect theory, I'll give you a brief example, but I'll save a lot of it for a later group who uses it heavily in their report. Okay, so the Chinese maritime militia is a illegal, coercive, aggressive, and deceptive tactic. The Philippines do not always use the term gray zone as they discuss these sort of tactics, because when you look at international arbitration, legal means, information means, and military means, the term gray zone is inherently difficult to bring to a court, to bring to an international diplomatic dispute. So they use the term ICAD. The United States military uses this as well. And throughout the next 4 presenters, you'll hear the term ICAD used a lot, especially with the narrative group. So we know that the PRC wants to rewrite the post-World War II international order, but what are they doing with this maritime militia? Think of this maritime militia as a pseudo Coast Guard, because that's exactly what they are. Estimates are that they have as many as 84 large vessels to up to 3,000 small vessels that they leverage throughout the West Philippine Sea, or in their view, the South China Sea, in order to intimidate. For example, they provide armed escort for their own PRC vessels. They intimidate other fishing vessels and try to push them out of their own fishing waters. And they've even been used as early as 1974 to capture the Paracel Islands from Vietnam. This is a pseudo Coast Guard. However, to the untrained eye, it may appear as though it's just a large group of fishing vessels. At any time, the PRC can enact them and bring them under military means to support their operations. So
You can just click on X. It's not Yuan. I don't know.
Oh, sorry.
Just on X. You don't need to.
No.
There you go.
I get carried away in my speech and I forget to admit the Zoom attendees. So PRC incrementalism is the #1 tactic that they're using here. They want to make it so subtle that you do not notice that the maritime militia is being used in subversive means. And that's where the term ICAD tactic comes into play. The ambiguous site of these vessels makes it very difficult for foreign militaries to act on them. And I'll leave it to the Maximum Transparency Campaign to talk to you about how they might showcase that. The actions of the maritime militia were found by Bryony to undermine the UN Convention for Law of the Sea, the international arbitration that was conducted, and generally speaking, the rules-based international order. PRC has a reluctance to negotiate multilaterally, and so they heavily leverage this maritime militia. Bryony found that this was out of a fear of legitimizing an unfavorable status quo. So they live within this risk-taking behavior intentionally, knowing that it is their primary means of pushing the status quo in their direction. Escalation still remains high with the maritime militia due to unclear command structures and the possibility of rogue actors. We found throughout our trip that there's a disconnect between Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party down to the maritime militia. Some of that disconnect is intentional and some of it is unintentional. And I would encourage you who are interested in that to save that for a question for Bryony at the end of the presentation. Again, they're doing this bit by bit. And to explain a little bit about the loss aversion and why they're going about it from the maritime militia. The term prospect theory dates back to the 1979 behavioral psychologist findings. Many of you know Danny Kahneman and Amos Tversky. They founded these principles, they reported on them. For the better part of 2 decades, they were used as a behavioral economics theory. However, in 1998, Dr. Rose McDermott was able to evaluate them as a means of international risk-taking from an international diplomatic and political standpoint. And let's see, from here, I want to talk to you beyond the risk-taking of the PRC to talk to you about what the Philippines are doing in order to counteract that, what their vulnerabilities are. Specifically, I'm going to talk to you about within the cyberspace operations domain. I'm going to talk to you about asymmetric maritime security. So Idalis reviewed the concept of cyber operations as a gray zone tactic in the West Philippine Sea. She reviewed where the Philippine nation sits from a vulnerability standpoint and what they need to do further to defend themselves. Her conceptual framework reviews cyber operations as a gray zone tactic. She investigates how actors use these operations to project power, including how to influence strategic outcomes and bypass traditional military and diplomatic means. She then identifies motivations for why actors prioritize cyber over conventional means and outlines the risks and mitigations for conflict escalation. The number one takeaway from Idalis' findings are that the Philippines sits in a phase of nascent cybersecurity. Some of the facts that she discusses in her piece are that their military cyberspace command did not actually begin until the year 2023. That's a 10-year gap from when the United States Cyber Command was stood up, at 13 years actually. Malicious cyber activity within the Philippines has quadrupled within the last several years. And what is very difficult, and she found this in her case study, is that attribution is incredibly difficult and or slow. And so many can presume or assume where these actions are coming from, but without a fingerprint on the malicious activity, it's hard to bring that to an international court. Therefore, it lives very well within the gray zone. They also have currently a low domain awareness. Should I admit someone else? Yeah. It's okay. They have low domain awareness. Again, that comes down to the fact that it's a nascent capability and they're building the process as we speak. Maritime cybersecurity infrastructure is vulnerable, and it continues to be vulnerable as they expand throughout the Calayan Island group. And their critical infrastructure sits at a unique juncture, and I don't want to steal her thunder so much, but foreign nations up to this point have been allowed and authorized by the Filipino government to run or own pieces of their critical infrastructure, which leads, as you can presume, to unique cyber vulnerabilities that need to be addressed. Again, as mentioned, public attribution is rare. And so what do we do? Idalis' main findings are that immediate deterrence is absolutely critical. However, a general deterrence approach in the cyber domain to increase your cybersecurity forces, to train them, to build reps and sets, as we say in the military, for long-term cybersecurity and situational awareness is paramount. They need to build rapid response and evaluation teams, especially as it relates to maritime cybersecurity and critical infrastructure, so that they can respond rapidly. And she also talks about evolving from a standpoint of just malicious cybercrime activity to state cyber activity, other nations going out and attempting to undermine Filipino national security. She outlines a cyber risk framework that begins with advanced threat attribution, which highlights down here within multilateral cooperation. It's not something that right now the Philippines is going to be able to do alone, but it's something that they can work with their partners such as the United States, Australia, Japan, Italy, and other actors in order to work together and build means of attribution and then build that into a long-term narrative. They will build or need to build off their cyber command that they built in 2023 using a coordinating agency, which they do have again from a cyber crime standpoint, but not as much from a state cyber operations standpoint. And then build out operations around escalation pathways. What can we expect another nation to do to us, and how will we respond to that preemptively, and determining how to cordon those networks off and then harden the networks from further attack. So the next slide I'm going to go into, I'm going to talk to you about modern deterrence theories. So we've talked a little bit about what the PRC is doing. We've talked about cyberspace operations from a Filipino vulnerability and capability standpoint. Now I'm going to talk to you about a niche capability. This is my topic on asymmetric maritime security. You can think of this as drones, counter drones, mid-range missiles, and dual-use technologies. Again, living maybe perhaps within the gray zone, but I want to frame this concept as what we may speak about here in America as drones being destructive, drones that launch an attack, drones that drop a bomb, drop a missile on another target, or explode themselves, as in the case of Russia, Ukraine, does not necessarily have to be every drone or capability that's used in order to create some level of deterrence because of their dual use nature and how that they can be evolved over time. So my conceptual framework reviews middle powers and how they leverage security partnerships to evolve in this domain. I investigate how to build an asymmetric maritime deterrence framework against larger forces, and I showed Russia-Ukraine as an example of that. I investigate how the PRC reacts to current Filipino asymmetric advancements, and then I review some of the key terrain and use cases. I end with an additional hypothesis of a future capacity of the Philippines as a leader in this dual use market down the road. Here's a visualization of my framework. In the top left, you see in figure 4, one of the unmanned systems I'm describing. This is not an explosive drone. This is an intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance drone that can provide simple maritime domain awareness well within the 100 to 200 nautical mile range that they need from the key terrain of Palawan, where the Philippines has just now begun investing in drone and counter-drone infrastructure because they know that the Palawan Island is the closest one to the disputed territories and disputed exclusive economic zones within the Calayan or Spratly Island group. And then figure 5, perhaps this might look intimidating to some of you. This is a Typhoon mid-range missile system that the US Army unloaded in Luzon and actually left behind. Loaded or not, tested or not, this is a mid-range missile that is positioned in Luzon, and the PRC reacted dramatically without actual kinetic conflict escalation. And this is where my visualization comes into play. So as asymmetric threats moved into the theater, the PRC did not reach a point of a fear of loss so much to escalate towards armed conflict and further violence, but rather they reinstituted existing policies of ICAT activities, or formerly known as gray zone activities. They rammed more ships, they shot more water cannons, they pointed more lasers at sailors' faces. However, they did not move into shooting any weapons. They did not kill any Coast Guardsmen or Filipino sailors. This cycle repeated itself, and there was a normative readjustment. Again, I don't want to steal the thunder of the maximum transparency campaign, but my infrastructure, my framework is all built on a modern deterrence framework that then compounds with complementary frameworks. Because in modern deterrence theory, you're essentially maintaining a negative peace. In other words, an absence of violence. However, you're not building a positive peace or enduring peace, which we'll talk about later. Moving on into my case study findings. So many of the missions that the Philippine government conducts in the West Philippine Sea are crewed. They're almost entirely crewed. They have people on board. They only leverage drones at a minor capacity to conduct minor ISR missions, and they're building that out as we speak. They have an emphasis on the maximum transparency campaign that I keep mentioning. And all I'm trying to say here is that the investment is heavily on this regard. And I'll talk about policy recommendations later, but just because you invest in drones does not mean you can't take pictures of what the Filipinos see within the West Philippine Sea and broadcast that to the international community. They lack a robust drone, counter-drone military culture, which the United States government is experiencing right now as we watch the Ukrainians defend against the Russian invasion of their sovereign territory for the last 3 years. And the Ukrainians have been the lead on innovating that culture, and everyone is watching. I found that the Ukrainian strategy in the Black Sea was incredibly effective. Part of that, as Georgi will discuss in the last slide that I have, is about credibility. It occurred in the middle of an active armed conflict. So it's a little easier to gain credibility when you, again, launch a drone and it strikes something, or it drops a bomb, or it launches a missile. However, what I found is that PRC decision cycles become more complex, and Xi Jinping is personally affected by mid-range missiles, by drones within the theater. And it's something that, again, going back to my framework, they just go back to what they're already doing. They go back to ICAT activities, they go back to advanced rhetoric, and the cycle continues. The Filipino potential as an asymmetric maritime security leader, my findings base that on US, Australia, and Japanese interests as maritime powers that seek to invest in low-cost capabilities to ensure that they're providing security from a military standpoint, but also from a dual-use standpoint. These governments want to monitor climate change just as much as the Filipino government wants to monitor climate change within the Calayan Island group, and drones can do that very easily at scale. My policy recommendations leverage drones as a risk reduction to human life. One thing that we haven't talked a lot about yet, but you'll hear, is the Mutual Defense Treaty of 1951, in which the United States government claims or agrees through a treaty with the Philippines that they will come to their defense, a mutual defense in the Pacific, is if either nation is attacked. So with a reduction of risk to human life, a loss of a drone costs money, but it doesn't create a world war. Conflict, as mentioned, can move towards negative peace. And then the kind of bigger picture of my findings are that I wish to see a policy where the Philippine government and the United States and other bilateral and multilateral relationships evolve in a multi-year phased approach in which it's not just the United States saying, here's $500 million of which drone counter drone is part of it. I want to see 5 to 10-year strategies that establish the Philippines as a leader in this niche dual use market, where the mid-range missiles are a piece of it, but not the end state necessarily. I see them evolving as a technical powerhouse. Many people forget, and a lot of us learned this on our trip, that the Philippine government sees themselves as a middle power. I don't know how many of you know, but the Philippines are the number 12 largest population in the world. They are the number 32 GDP in the world. However, in the maritime domain, they're very proud of this. They are the number 1 provider of international mariners on the international commercial maritime market. It's the Philippine government. It's their people. They're the ones training. They're the ones living abroad. They're the ones sailing the most vessels at the most percentage of any other country in the world. So by those means, I consider them a middle power, especially in the maritime domain. And then finally, the end of my concept is a grand strategy, which the Filipinos see as something they just released last year. It's a comprehensive archipelagical defense concept. The sub-concepts of this, we could not read all of it. We only saw what we saw in open source. So this may already be incorporated behind the scenes, but my findings and my policy recommendations are a comprehensive approach, leveraging the information domain to continue the maximum transparency campaign you'll hear about, to continue the legal international arbitration that you hear about, and to build public and private institutions that capitalize on this niche market. So those are kind of the 3 views. And at the end of the report, we're going to go with Georgi's review. I think it's an anniversary of Jaws at some point. So we have needing a bigger boat, asymmetric deterrence in the West Philippine Sea. What Georgi did is he looked at states around the world and what they can do from a large scale perspective of deterrence against large expansionist neighbors. And specifically, what can the Philippine government do next beyond embracing cyberspace operations, beyond embracing just asymmetric maritime security capabilities? His 2 questions are, to what extent has the Philippines already established this deterrence framework? And then finally, absent sufficient deterrence, what are the next steps? So Georgi found, as I mentioned earlier, that deterrence must be credible. Whether you're researching conflict management theories from the Cold War and nuclear deterrence theory, the nuclear bomb was used prior to the expectation of deterrence between the great nuclear powers. However, from the Cold War through to what we've seen in Russia, Ukraine, so has conventional weapons. So have asymmetric maritime weapons, such as drones and counter drones, as mentioned earlier. So what his findings are, and this is keeping, we believe it's keeping with my framework and the picture I showed you before, is that asymmetric deterrence struggles against ICAT activities. In other words, that ICAT cycle will continue, and you do have to rely on complementary frameworks to escape that cycle. However, it's better than an escalation cycle in which it goes beyond ICAT activities into something more. The Philippine government must maintains the political will and domestic stability to strengthen deterrence capabilities. And that he also found that asymmetric capabilities can empower smaller states to deter large scale military action. The this is a good time to mention more about what the Ukrainians essentially did in the Black Sea. A non-existent, I don't want to say non-existent, but a nearly non-existent Ukrainian Navy was able to use standoff weapons and drones to create an innovative framework to disable, destroy, and essentially put the Russian Black Sea Fleet to a point of inactivity. The Russian Black Sea Fleet has a zone that they know that they can live within without being destroyed or shot at. And that was all done without a traditional Navy. As a naval officer, I can tell you that that is a complete evolution of everything that we know about in naval theory, and the evolution is continuing as we see today. And I think Georgi would agree that the Philippine government has the potential here. However, they have a lot of work left to be done. His findings are that the U.S. alliance is absolutely key to deterring PRC attack. From a financial standpoint, from an investment standpoint, from a diplomatic standpoint, they must continue to rely on the United States alliance and leveraging the 1951 Mutual Defense Treaty as a hedge rather than an over-reliance of, well, this is all that we have for deterrence. They currently do not have sufficient deterrent capabilities. For example, within the asymmetric domain, that drone that I showed you, those are only just now being instituted in Palawan this year, 2025. The command and control center for them has not been built yet. So more has to be done right now, and they're not there yet. The external defense policy is in its early stages, and the budget constraints continue to limit defense spending. I'll give you a little hint. One of you should ask a question to Georgi after these presentations about what exactly is holding back the defense budget, because there's some very unique historical reasons that to you and me might not make perfect sense. And it's a bureaucratic hurdle that's holding them back from investment. In terms of further recommendations, Georgi pushes for them not just for asymmetric warfare capabilities or security capabilities, but to grow the size of their Coast Guard fleet as well. While I argue very much to swarm the domain with drones and counter-drone systems, Georgi's right in that they have to maintain a consistent presence with crewed and manned vessels that can continue to operate within the exclusive economic zone, protect Filipino sovereign rights, and to conduct operations with the United States and with the future unmanned systems. And then finally, to pursue domestic stability and foreign policy continuity. This is a crucial piece of Georgi's findings in that the Philippine government has seen dramatic changes over the last 10 years in terms of leadership perspectives, alliances, changing agreements, at least from a narrative standpoint. And the more stable that they can be in everything that I've just mentioned, the more likely they are to succeed within modern deterrence theory. So with that, this kind of closes out the presentation for group one. I want to just close by saying throughout all four of these pieces, I think we would all agree that the Philippines can institute some of these policies to, as Bryony said in her report, retake some of the ownership of escalation dominance. The PRC believes they own escalation dominance. So the question then is, how can we use what you saw in these presentations to retake a percentage of that and keep the cycle towards negative peace? And with that, I'm going to move on to the complementary frameworks to modern deterrence and the gray zone tactics. Ms. Lindsay Bach is going to review with you some of the narratives that are going along, including domestic actions that the Philippine government can take, such as the maximum transparency campaign that I mentioned no less than 30 times during my speech.
That's my dad. It's my dad. It's your dad? Yeah. I don't trust my sister. Sarah. You have. Whatever. I don't have this. I have. People might need the visuals. What
Floor is yours.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Matt. That was a wonderful presentation to kick us off. I hope I can follow that up. So today I'm going to talk about narratives in domestic politics. Matt already mentioned that, so it kind of carries through. We'll be talking about tides of nationalism, claiming the sea, shaping the story, Chinese disinformation wedge strategies, and the Philippine Transparency Initiative. This kind of fits together. Juliet's research will speak to broader culture, nationalism, and conflict. And then Thomas's research will go into looking at more data-driven, large N studies. So how does that specifically appear in this conflict? Then I will fall on with Chinese disinformation wedge strategies, which is also a form of narrative. So I'll kind of tie those together. And then Maggie has a follow-up to that where she'll talk about the Transparency Initiative, which is the current response, and kind of look at how that's faring, some evaluation, successes, etc. So for Juliet's research, the tides of nationalism, and talking about shaping identity. So for her research question, to what extent has the West Philippine Sea conflict reshaped national identity and nationalism in China and the Philippines? So she's kind of measuring conflict and national identity and looking at the loop and how they relate to each other. So independent variable, territorial, maritime conflict, and how that impacts or relates to national identity and nationalism. She finds that the two variables interact in the circular dynamic, as I mentioned, where national identity shapes the stance in conflict, and in turn can actually form the reverse. So her conceptual framework will have multiple levels, complex, brilliant. I will try to kind of break that down. So 2 levels of analysis. So first, that's what we just discussed, that kind of circular relationship. And then that second narrative, which is the conflict shaping the national identity. And looking at 2 different pathways where you can actually see that. So we'll see that on the 3rd slide. So first off, there's 2 different measurements in these 2 different pathways. So country A, you're going to see a kind of ethno-nationalist framework. You're also going to see that combined with a type of regime, which is authoritarian. This results in better control of public narratives and perception, and also a more aggressive, assertive nationalism, which also results in more escalation as opposed to de-escalation. Then you kind of see the bottom section, country B, is a bit the opposite, where it's dependent on civic nationalism. You're going to see that more in democracies, less control over the narratives, and more fluid identity, less cohesion, but that actually tends to result in de-escalation or more stabilization. So she's applying this framework to the West Philippine Sea. And so she comes out with conclusions from this. So as we discussed before, 1st level, 2nd level. So that 1st level, ethno-nationalism and exclusive national identity, which results in a more aggressive stance in conflict. The 2nd level looks at how this identity is reinforced and actually pulls in the conflict as a main part of that nationalism. This has results in that circular dynamic and actually in a vicious cycle, and again, applied to ethno-nationalism, authoritarian regimes, so it tracks throughout. Then the Philippines, the 1st level of alignment and foreign policy, they identify more with Western values and political kind of performativity, which you see more in democratic cases. And this actually resulted in more diplomatic and legal stance, which kind of mirrors onto that framework. For the 2nd level, there was some increase in nationalism, and the state kind of forms around that, kind of creating a shared identity in response to the conflict, and also increased the identity of a middle power, et cetera. And this actually also, you can see, results in more of those legal frameworks, which we'll talk about later, kind of that, excuse me, narrative and rhetoric. So some of the big takeaways here are these findings really deployed kind of constructivist research, which a lot of us have done before. So it takes this kind of classic understanding and then applies it to the conflict management field and is really relevant to this case. For generalizability, this can be really applied to any diverging conflict, especially when you're seeing kind of the identity narratives, nationalism involved. So it has much broader implications in use. And then next we'll turn to Thomas. So we're kind of looking at the identity generalization and narrative. And then Thomas actually like deeply studies what we're seeing in the South China Sea. So for the framing and research questions, what narrative does China employ to frame its conflict with the Philippines? So Thomas took kind of the key assumption as it's not so much about scarcity of resources, but unmet basic human needs as the kind of cause of conflict. So it's kind of framing. And specifically has seen that China's challenged international law and has attempted to build a domestic framework. And this will play in later as we're starting to see more legal frameworks. And then Thomas also found that narratives are an important facet of conflict, especially because can morph, change, influence perception. And that's a key underpinning of all of these topics is that if perception changes, it changes how everyone sees the world. It changes how you see the conflict, which is the underpinning of the conflict. So his argument is China relies on a domestic legal framework to defend its claims, but has modulated its rhetoric over time, and I'll get into that. So for the methods, Thomas deployed supervised machine learning over 1,200 sentences from the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs news conferences and characterized these into 5 different narrative classifications. So that's legal, foreign encroachment, regional peace, bilateral resolution, and Chinese sovereignty. So what does this really mean? Thomas went through a lot of different narratives, looked at individual sentences that were used and used that to evaluate what does the narrative actually look like, and then was able to use supervised machine learning beyond my capacity and kind of mapped this out. And so this looks fairly complex, but what it's really just trying to show is the vast, like large N computations that are possible to one, use as a methodology, and 2, also to determine the findings. So for the results and takeaways, 2 different graphs here, I'll kind of walk through them. So the one on the left is mostly showing, like I said before, kind of the responsiveness to the Philippines administration and also change over time. So essentially the takeaway from this one is that during President Duterte's era, there was a lot more discussion of like bilateral narrative, and then during Marcos, a lot more sovereignty. And so you see those kind of differences drawn over time, and that is significant, showing that there's at least some modulation. And then on the right, essentially, I'll just read this because I know it's a little small, but regional peace is up in the left corner and tracks down to the bottom left. And so it's showing that if you kind of merge across these 2 different axes, what 2 narratives are used in sentences together and where you kind of see that. So what he's finding here in this dark blue section is that legal narratives are prominent, and also China's sovereignty, and then 3rd, bilateral resolution. So you kind of track.
Legal, right?
Sorry?
Domestic legal.
Yeah. So some of the key takeaways here from this research are the possibilities with large N computational studies, and also merging different types of research. So conflict management, there's a lot more kind of flexibility, creativity, a little bit of an art to it. This kind of draws in that data and can be really powerful. And then also key findings from the research itself are actors are strategic and narratives are key. So that is what we're taking away from this, which leads into my research very well. So next I'll be talking about Chinese disinformation wedge strategies, influence operations, and the US-Filipino alliance. My paper itself was quite complex, so I'm going to try to kind of break it down here for this presentation. So essentially what I was looking at is how do rival powers deploy wedge strategies to weaken relationships between the rival allied nations? So if you have two nations on different sides of a conflict, one side has an alliance, what types of strategies can be deployed to break that alliance and change that kind of power asymmetry or balance? So I specifically looked into the effects of Chinese disinformation campaigns or operations as a wedge strategy on Filipino domestic support for that US-Filipino alliance, and if this had a broader impact in the South China Sea or West Philippine Sea conflict. So my argument one is just the strength of alliance matters for countering disinformation and also countering territorial expansion. And also the second finding that was a little bit more unique and measured was that disinformation can be effective when it ends up changing perceptions, but it also can cause a people, a country to actually stick to that alliance even more. So here's a conceptual framework. I'll walk you through it. Essentially, based on a number of pieces of literature across the conflict management field and also like information operations, disinformation, et cetera, I developed an idea about deterring a rival from asserting territorial expansion. And essentially the crux is that the rival alliance must remain strong. So in order to upset this alliance, a rival nation will deploy disinformation strategies in the attempt to sow distrust and weaken the alliance. And this is often, as we have talked about before, used by building resonant narratives that increase the likelihood of the message being resonant and proliferating and being shared and therefore successful. So I find that if this is effective, it changes domestic political perceptions, which then changes the risk calculations of being in that alliance. And this disrupts the alliance. Even if it's just weakening or breaking, it changes that risk calculation. However, if it's ineffective, one, you might not see the effects, but two, it can also backfire, hardening the resolve of the country who's having those disinformation operations deployed, and harden that resolve to be a part of that alliance. So overall, the findings, again, that I have also shared across my colleagues is, the importance of a strong alliance. In this research uniquely too, I looked at domestic politics, which it can be often overlooked in conflict management because it's usually two international sides. And that influence operations are indeed something that should be paid attention to for the main fact that perceptions change how politics, how people look at a conflict. For policy recommendations, in order to counter this disinformation and this entire flow of weakening an alliance, some of the best approaches were whole of society approaches. So that's essentially viewing across society that there are strengths and weaknesses and expertise that can be capitalized on. So that's across the private sector, government, academic, education, and basically forming a network that can actually work together with their own legal capabilities to combat this encroaching. And another key finding was that building trust in institutions is critical. So the more the domestic populace trusts their government and their country, the more likely they are to be able to dispel these disinformation narratives and really understand. So this includes information, open media. And then finally, regulation and lawfare is very challenging. We've seen examples from Taiwan, Canada, the EU, and the US. And so these can act as really good baselines for what works and what doesn't, and what are the implications. Right, and now we will move to the actual Filipino response also to these disinformation strategies and to the broader conflict as a whole. And so Maggie will talk about specifically how can domestic government structures respond to gray zone tactics. So as a background, this is looking at kind of like the bureaucratic politics and looking at structures of government and their ability to respond and how that actually plays out. So the key puzzle, how can victim states respond to gray zone tactics and non-kinetic warfare used by aggressor states? What is the effectiveness of the Philippine Transparency Initiative? And I also want to address too the all of the different kind of terminology that we have talked about is really specific to the literature that we've studied for our conceptual frameworks. So this identifies that there's one kind of narrative coming into another country, and that's kind of how this terminology is used in specifically in asymmetric power imbalance. So the main argument for Maggie is it's gray. It's gray zone. We have lots of different lots of different findings. So I'll walk through that. Essentially, victim states should respond, and transparency is a tool that states should use with caution and in coalition. So the conceptual framework actually bases on other countries that have also experienced some of these challenges. And as was mentioned before with Georgi's work on Russia and Eastern Europe, China and Taiwan, and also the Cuban Missile Crisis. And as I mentioned earlier, she deploys the organizational and bureaucratic process models. So essentially looking at kind of those democratic government systems. So essentially the takeaways from her research look into one, what was accomplished, what was effective. So across both the domestic and political, raising awareness was very effective. And I just want to back up for 1 second too and be very clear. This is so this was the Philippines Transparency Initiative, which was essentially broadcasting what was going on in the South China Sea, West Philippine Sea to show to the world what was happening in a very kind of rapid, like clear way. Yeah, very responsive. And so this is what she's finding from measuring exactly what the effects of that were. So again, goals accomplished. It was helped a lot with transparency and raising awareness. On the domestic level, helped with countering malign influence, just as my topic covered earlier. And then also on the international level, it actually helped build kind of informal and formal coalitions with like-minded countries and other states that might be experiencing similar situations, which will be the final point as well. For the next 2 points, for the missing the PRC as an audience and also missing claimant states as an audience, there's also some capacity to expand this initiative where the target audiences of who might be reading or who might be able to interact with this information could be expanded as well, and that can have other consequences down the line. And then getting to the bureaucratic politics model, we all know sometimes bureaucracy can have good intentions to build out different mechanisms, make sure that there's the right people involved in decision making, make sure there's the right approvals, and then at a certain point too, the bureaucracy gets too heavy, and so you can kind of cut and make sure that the right sources are reviewing things, the right groups are working on everything. So that's another finding, and then finally. As I mentioned earlier, too, kind of this coalition of like-minded that the Philippines can also learn from other states that have experienced similar impacts, and then also they can share information. So continuing to build these relationships where they're sharing knowledge and sharing outcomes. So that is it. Thank you.
Very much. Okay, next in line, going to be a group that loosely focuses on disruption as a theme that connects them. Kalita, you have the floor.
Just make sure I'm not beyond time. My name is Kalita. I'm here on behalf of my group to present our independent research. I want to thank them for trusting me on doing the job. If I miss some points, please raise your hand, but also you're all gonna have the opportunity to ask questions directly to them after the presentations. So disruption and escalation management, we are going to discuss trade, supply chains, and non-state actors. I would like to start with a brief introduction on each of us topic. So Jinhua, that's here, he discussed how private sector can influence decision-making in asymmetric conflicts. Liliana has researched the role of transnational organized crime as a tool of coercive statecraft. And Sophia, she analyzed how the Philippines can intercept Chinese tankers passing through the EE zone. And the last one is mine. I use the prospect theory to analyze if trade can be a factor that helps escalate or de-escalate conflicts. Let me start here with Jinhua. And as I mentioned before, he looked at the private sector. He wants to analyze, and he analyzed actually, how the private sector is able to influence political decisions. To do that, he first studied and understand. He was analyzing by the Filipino perspective, just to frame it better. So he studied how the economic structure is defined in the Philippines, which means what is the proportion of the private sector in the Filipino economy. Also, another important indicator he was looking for is what is the presence of the private sector in critical sectors, for example, energy and telecommunications. The third point, to create a scenario, the ability of influence. And to do that, he was looking for some data on, for example, media transparency and how the private sector can influence, or the role and the space they have for doing lobbying, for example. Unfortunately, we don't have a beautiful graph here. I was trying to make it very concise, but Jinhua did a great job. He explained his work, was amazing. He created an index to measure how much the private sector is more likely or less likely to influence political decisions. And he did that based on some World Bank data. He measured like governance, transparency, the structure again of each country's economic infrastructure. And he got that in the case of the Philippines, the score was 0.6. The index was, the variation was from 0 to 1. And the bigger the number, it means bigger the influence of the private sector. So 0.6 is a quite higher number, which means the private sector, in the case of the Philippines, they are able to influence political decisions. And another found that he had, it's the oligarchy structure. So basically, the private sector is very concentrated on the hands of small groups, dominating lots of aspects of the private sector. An important aspect to bring here, they are not a monolithic group. So it's oligarchy, it doesn't mean they think the same. And this is important to understand what comes next. So if we want to relate what he found about the landscape of economic sector, we have to relate on how this influences on decision-making and in the conflict. The private sector has agency, they really can influence. They influence to escalate or de-escalate, it depends. There were sometimes some moments during the history of the Philippines, the government and the private sector, they were aligned. So they could combine or deterring, for example, foreign investment or foreign influence, and this has also a role in the conflict. In another moments, they cannot be aligned, which can be a problem, for example, for national security. Let's suppose the government wants to de-escalate, but for the private sector, it's interesting to escalate, to counter China, to deter how much China puts their money in the Philippines. So there's a contradiction, and this can be a problem to national security. And the main takeaways here is just wrapping up what he found. The private sector, yes, they have an agency, they can shape the conflict, and how to manage this depends. Also, he mentioned when he was explaining to me that it's very hard to understand exactly how the relationship of the government and the private sector unfolds, as this is a very opaque procedure. So there's a council who's often meeting with the president, but we don't know what is discussed. And this is why one of the measures he used is media transparency. Because is media able to access and report on these or not? This is important to understand the influence. If it's not transparent, eventually the private sector can influence more. Moving forward, we have here Liliana Caracosa Lopez research. She did a great job analyzing how transnational organized crime can be a tool to coerce the statecraft. She used here the greed and grievance theories combined to the spoiler theories. She's analyzing non-state actors and how they can influence the decision-making in these influences impacts on escalating or not the conflict. But here she's analyzing the context that eventually some criminal organizations, they are doing their crimes because they are looking for profits, for example. They are not necessarily backed by the government. In some cases, we're gonna see soon that they can be, but it's also very hard to make it very clear and to affirm that. And usually these criminal organizations, they use ICAD tactics that we mentioned before, also called and very known as gray zone tactics. So specifically, what Liliana analyzed was POGOs, that is the Philippine offshore gaming operations, human trafficking, illegal fishing, environmental crime, and drug trafficking. Each of these impacts the decision-making differently, and each of these is related to the government differently. So POGOs, for example, this gaming operations, they enabled scan compounds and cyber fraud, or for example, espionage. So this is a thing, and this is why it was prohibited. Human trafficking is how external forces can coerce workers from false job offers, especially in the Southeast region. Illegal fishing and environmental crime. I don't know if you spend some time looking at videos on the internet, I recommend on how the tactics work in the case of the Chinese and Philippines dispute work. There are lots of, we mentioned here, laser pointing, water jets, and also one of the strategies of China was occupying some islands or building artificial islands. And this has a huge impact, for example, in the environment and for fishing. Lots of people in the region depends on fishing, either for their own survival or for making money to afford life. And so this change on the environment also can lead to crime, as people don't have their resources, their typical resources, to make their money. And drug trafficking, as the Philippines is also a key point on the transit, on the hub for methamphetamine that links Chinese tribes with Latin American cartels. What is important here on the findings that Liliana did is, so although eventually the criminal forces or the criminal organizations are not backed or supported by the governments from both sides, and this is important, she looked from the two directions, from the Philippines to China and China to the Philippines, they can influence and the governments can benefit from these illegal actions. And how they benefit, they don't act, they don't curb. So, and because you can use these external actors to influence and make your oppositor weaker. So her recommendations are regional cooperation. So not just one country enforcing the law. You should use like international law, but also make a collaborative work to curb this kind of criminal actions. Also, policy should go beyond military and criminalization, but discuss transparency, economic alternatives, and cross-border governance. Third, we have here Sofia Data. She did a great job researching if the Philippines can or cannot intercept Chinese tankers passing through alternative routes. And I'm going to go back a little bit to just explain a frame that Sofia explained before. We are discussing here the situation of a wartime situation. So if there's a war, what can happen? And this is something that China is very preoccupied with. It's the Malacca dilemma. Unfortunately, we don't have a graph, so you have to trust me and we can look after the graph. But the Malacca Strait is a very important route for international trade. So basically, China receives oil from the Middle East or Western countries or other products, not just oil, but oil is an important one, through the Malacca Strait. If a war happens in the region, especially if, in this case, China and Philippines, they are in a conflict, what China is afraid is the US and its allies can block this strait. If this happens, in order to get alternative routes to get their products, China has to find alternative routes. And Sophia created a scenario to understand, in the case of an alternative route, is the Philippines able or not to intercept these tankers? Which means, if a war happens, can Philippines deter and prevent China to get the products they need or not? To do this, she elaborated a very interesting framework based on 3 main pillars, that is legal authority, military capability, and maritime domain awareness. What she brings is a country, here in this case the Philippines, but it can be applied to any country. If one of these conditions doesn't hold, if this country doesn't have legal authority or military capability or maritime domain awareness, they cannot deter an external force. And analyzing more specifically to the Filipino case, although she recognizes that it's possible that the Philippines can have the legal authority to intercept this, it could be very difficult considering the UNCLOS, international law, and also Filipino law. So it can be a problem. Maybe the Philippines doesn't have the framework, the legal framework to intercept the vessels. Military capability, this is something a little bit easier to understand. They don't have assets and trainment enough to deter Chinese tanks passing from an alternative route. Moreover, we also have military domain awareness, that is the capability of the Philippines or any country to understand who is passing by the region that you're monitoring. So what she found is that the Philippines now is not able to intercept Chinese tankers in this case of a wartime scenario because they don't attend these 3 criteria. And again, if you don't have 3 of them, if you just have military capability, this is not enough. You have to rely on 3 of them. I just jumped my own set. Okay, so my challenge was to challenge the liberal theory, to understand the liberal theory overall understands that trade can be a factor to make the states more likely to engage in a conflict. Because if 2 countries, they have trade, they tend to have economic benefits. So what you're just losing money, basically. So this is the assumption, and I'm challenging and using prospect theory to address that. What prospect theory is, I know that Matt already introduced a little bit, but we tend, so different from liberal understanding, actors are risk averse in the domain of gains, but risk seeking in domain of losses. Trying to explain a little bit better, you're more likely to enter in a dispute if you see you can lose something, but you're less likely to enter in a dispute if the dispute serves for you to obtain something. And this is important to understand. This is not simple rational decision on escalating or not escalating in a conflict. Another gain from using prospect theory here is the use of reference points. And reference point is when a country or an individual, an actor, it can be applied also for individual decision-making. We are analyzing here decision-making, where you frame what you're gaining or losing. In the case of territorial disputes, usually the actors involved, they are analyzing the status quo. Am I losing power? Am I losing a territory? So this is how they frame their decisions, and then you can understand, am I gaining or am I losing? And this is very important to understand if I should escalate or de-escalate. So this is the framework, the main framework that I applied, but I also use the comprehension of future expectations of trade, which means you're not looking for just what trade can give you right now, but in the future, can trade give you benefits or not? Another framework that I just jumped to the third one is the trade's effect on, it's that the trades affect conflict depends on how interdependent the countries are, how if there's an asymmetry between the two powers, and multipolarity, which means does this country or these countries also trade with other countries, or they're so concentrated. So the more diversified, this can change and influence differently. My findings, looking through some data from 2010 and 2022, we could see trade increased 281%. And at the same time, escalation also intensified, which comes to my final conclusion here. Trade alone is insufficient to ensure peace. I'm not able with this research to say exactly what is influencing or not. And my idea on bringing this is to bringing awareness. We need to look to we need to use this framework and other frameworks to understand better what are the other factors that are influencing the decision making. Just trade is not enough. And I just brought briefly here 2 examples. During Duterte's government, he was leaning towards China, and there was some sort of de-escalation and a better environment for trade, but not necessarily this last during the government, even though he was trying to approach China. Under Marcos' administration, who has adopted a much more aggressive position towards China, we are not seeing de-escalation on the conflict, but we are also seeing the trades going very well. And what I want to recommend, and I expect more people can pay attention on this and make it better, it's how conflict management can benefit on the application of prospect theory. And we can also understand better by conducting qualitative research to understand the decision-making process in the Philippines and China. Doing this in China specifically is even more opaque than the Philippines. So this is part of the challenge that I found on analyzing these pictures here. And just to conclude, the recommendations overall here, the private sector, rolling asymmetric competition, yes, they can be super influential, and we need to go further. And Jinghua showed, in the case of the Philippines, they play an important role. Liliana is also raising here that transnational organization crimes. They are a strategic instrument, and countries need to address this in a more collaborative way, not just as a military or criminal approach. Sophia could understand that now the Philippines is not able to intercept Chinese tanks in the case of a wartime situation. And if China looks for this specific, I'm sorry, I didn't mention what is the alternative route she was analyzing. It's the Lombok-Makassar route corridor. She analyzed this specific one that is the most likely China could use. And she could understand so far with the situation now, they cannot intercept Chinese tankers. And last is my own research that I just said. I just recommend more studies should be conducted applying prospect theory in conflict management, and also the specific case of South China Sea should also be analyzed from other perspectives to understand what else other than trade can influence, or in which situations trade could really influence conflict escalation. Thank you so much.
All right, that is the group that will help us understand the normative domain of this conflict. Elena will be the presenter.
Thank you very much, Professor.
Maybe you can speak up a bit.
Yes, that's my known issue. I'll try to start timing myself. And good afternoon, everyone. I'm Elena Mikhailian. And before I start our presentation, I do want to take a moment to recognize our talented peers and also express appreciation to all the family and friends tuning in from around the world. To my family, I want to say yes, the Shatsirumem. And when it comes to our research, we will be presenting on multilateralism and normative regulation of asymmetric conflicts, of course, in the case of the Philippines in the South China Sea dispute. My fellow members are Alexis Sawyer, Rachel Bilheimer, and Yuan Dong. And our presentation covers 4 respective topics while sharing warning signs and concludes with formulation of specific potential policy recommendations at the very end collectively. So to start with, Alexis's research, which focuses, which centers around the norm collision taking place between 2 great powers. In our case, it is about US and China. She analyzes the implications of these collisions for regional states and how corresponding hedging strategies complicate and even impede the ability of a zone of possible agreement, the ZOPA. So her research explores how does norm contestation between the US and China, compounded by ASEAN states, strategic hedging, impact the prospects for achieving multilateral ZOPA. She argues, she has 2 main arguments. First, that norm collisions through FONOPs and competing territorial claims fuel conflict and they undermine international legal consensus. And the second is that divergent hedging strategies fragment regional unity and collapse such ZOPA. Alexis also argues that US FONOPs like high-profile operations of US Lassen and Decatur are framed by US as a legal assertion, but they also intensify this rivalry between US and China and place pressure on the regional ASEAN states. China views them simply as provocations, and they escalate these tensions and lead to regional instability. And disputes over innocent passage and EEZ, the exclusive economic zone, reveal that ambiguous legal interpretations can lead to fueling of these norm collisions between these great powers in the region and affect and have destabilizing effects. Critically, she argues that unilateral FONOPs lack regional consensus and generate mixed signals that undermine such diplomacy and strategic alignment. As you can see on this slide in detail, we've put together how each of the members of ASEAN, particularly Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, and Indonesia, they employ these hedging strategies to maintain some flexibility, but they have different degrees of these hedging strategies. Next. I'm sorry, I'm actually struggling with this slide. Okay, it's here, I think. This,
You have a clicker?
this was only, no, it didn't work earlier. Okay, here. Okay. We're good. Thank you. Okay. So when it comes to the implications, US's efforts to build for support for joint FONOPs have failed, because many of these ASEAN member states, they just feel comfortable and they vary of antagonizing China. So hedging patterns vary, as I highlighted in the earlier slide, from hard balancing to cautious engagement with China. And ultimately, Alexis concludes that without diplomatic coordination and multilateral consensus, escalatory norm enforcement risks deepening divisions. And institutional frameworks like UNCLOS, they will be remaining vulnerable when states adopt self-serving legal interpretations of it without credible enforcement mechanisms. Now we will be moving to Rachel's research, And as we can see, what we would like to highlight as Alexis's research highlighted, norms may evolve to broad acceptance and internalization, as well as diminish and erode through different types of contestation. Rachel's research centers on how states become norm contesters and eventually norm makers by strategically challenging international legal authority. Her paper investigates how China's rejection of the 2016 South Sea arbitration ruling illustrates the role of powerful states as China in contesting the legitimacy of international legal norms, and what are the implications for the resiliency and fragmentation of the maritime legal order in this case. She has several main arguments and drawing on the international norm theory and scholarship on norm contestation, norm robustness, and legal fragmentation. Rachel argues that China's response shows a validity contestation. She also argues that China's response to the ruling represents a strategic act of non-compliance. And lastly, she highlights that the form of contestation not only weakens the resiliency of the UNCLOS norm cluster to be a tool of conflict escalation, but also contributes to regional legal fragmentation. Rachel is quite detailed, as you can see, in terms of the findings. We've put together this table that walks you through the implications of each of those findings. And there are top 5 collectively that we would like to highlight. First is China's outright rejection of the ruling as a case of validity contestation, which poses the most serious challenge to the norm robustness here. Second is when it comes to continued militarization of maritime features by China, while remaining within UNCLOS, it reflects on strategic non-compliance. This is purposeful. It is a dual-track legal strategy that avoids formal exit, but undermines the regime from within. Third is when it comes to China-ASEAN Code of Conduct, it's other research also highlighted by our peers. It shows the emergence of regional legal fragmentation, as China definitely has a leeway among the states and impacts their decision-making. Fourth is when it comes to the case of Philippines, Vietnam, and Malaysia, they have varied responses, and these they have varied responses when it comes to UNCLOS interpretation, and that demonstrates inconsistent norm defense in this case. And the fifth, the final, is that although external actors like US and EU in this case have publicly reaffirmed the ruling, so they upheld Philippines' side interpretation of UNCLOS in this case, such discursive support alone has proven to be insufficient. You need a little bit more walk to this talk, let's put it this way. And moving on to the implications, we highlighted these 4, that powerful state-led norm contestation, particularly of a validity nature, it can destabilize others in the region as well when it comes to robust legal orders. Second is regional contestation can foster legal pluralism, and these regimes that are not immune to fragmentation will be delegitimized. And then third is weakening of this dispute settlement function disrupts normative coercion. It undermines the functional interdependence of the broader maritime order. And lastly, these norm clusters cannot rely on institutionalization alone, and they require active defense and normative reinforcement. We will be now transitioning to our third team members research that focuses on ASEAN's institutional limitations. Yuan's research begins with the core puzzle, simple as that. Why does ASEAN demonstrate strong diplomatic intent, yet repeatedly fail to take action in times of crisis? His main argument is that this pattern is best explained by the interaction of two structural constraints. First is the consensus-based norms, and the second one is the institutional design. The first refers to it's best known for the ASEAN way of doing things. You know, it's about discouraging open disagreement. We understand the context within the region. Second refers to the fact that underpowered secretariat and the instability of rotating chairmanship prevents strong leadership or policy continuity when it comes to ASEAN's purpose as an organization. To explain these dynamics, Yuan adopts an integrated theoretical framework that draws on constructivism, collective action theory, and institutionalism. You can see the components of each on the slide. And given the time, I will move forward to the next more interesting, engaging findings for us. Yuan highlighted the three cases that has demonstrated ASEAN's inaction. The first one was in 2012, when there was the Huanyao Dao crisis. During the meeting, one of the ASEAN foreign ministers meeting, Philippines proposed ASEAN to address China's actions regarding the Scarborough Shoal, and Cambodia at the time as a chair simply opposed to incidents reference, and that led to their inability to issue any joint state communique. The second case in 2016, the infamous arbitral ruling, the chair at the time, Laos, they were not comfortable to be directly referencing the arbitration, and they opted for maintaining diplomatic relations with China. And last case that Yuan highlighted is the 2023 Rinai Shoal tensions. At the time, Chair Indonesia, they avoided confrontation and simply issued a diluted statement that called for restraint. Moving to the implications piece, Yuan highlights that such non-claimant chairs with ties to China, they act as veto powers, and they paralyze the actions of or decision making of ASEAN. Then when it comes to ASEAN Secretariat, it simply lacks authority and capacity to lead or mediate in this context. And thirdly, this requirement for consensus, this consensual rule, in fact reduces outcomes to the lowest common denominator, often meaning no action at all. What's interesting is, and again, for the purposes of generalizability of our research, Yuan also drew on the fact that this is not something unique to ASEAN. When it comes to this consensus rule-based organizations, they suffer similarly, and examples are the African Union, Gulf Cooperation Council. And finally, we are moving to my research, which brings together the earlier discussions from the context of alliance diversification as strategic leverage, as the tool that can offset this power asymmetry in territorial disputes. And my research question, well, let me actually step back for a second. To frame my analysis, let's consider this WOMAX asymmetric attention model. You can see there is country A, the larger one that has larger projection and more influence, more scope of influence at country B, which is the smaller state. And we are very careful with terminology here. We're talking about smaller state, not small state. There's a separate section in the research dedicated to definition of it. So it's more relational towards the other party and the context rather than metrics of GDP, population, or else, or territory. So we can see that a larger state has bigger influence one way or another at a smaller state, and the smaller state is very much in a more focused area of influence. In the case of Philippines here, we are talking about the South China Sea dispute. This is where my research question becomes salient. How can the smallest state, in our case, Philippines, through strategic alliance diversification, offset power asymmetry, trying to move things, and navigate ICAT earlier stated tactics employed by larger states, in our case, China, in this South China Sea dispute. I have two main arguments. The first one is that alliance diversification enables smaller states to offset power asymmetry into domain-specific contests where they held these comparative advantages. The second piece is unilateral partnerships, in fact, that they optimize conflict escalation management by providing tailored capabilities to support the smaller state in preserving their diplomatic flexibility while being, hopefully, avoiding the entrapment between great power competition or else. This is not working again. Okay, we're here. Okay, moving forward to the findings. Oh no, the flags are not visible. We had the flags. Yes, so I went through categorizing all different engagements that Philippines has, and it's really interesting. You will see also the language that's used here. There are military alliances, there are economic partnerships, normative coalitions, and unilateral cooperation. You see the examples that I've selected here. The US Mutual Defense Treaty complicates China's calculus in this case for ICAT escalations, then economic partnerships with Japan, with South Korea, the EU. What's interesting here, the EU's Global Gateway Initiative, that's the one to offset more or less the Belt and Road Initiative by China. This reduced economic coercion by China and diversifies supply chains for the Philippines. Normative coalitions with UNCLOS supporting states, in this case, EU, Australia, Canada, they help counter China's narrative and claims generally. And lastly, when it comes to unilateral cooperation, this is something I found to be one of the interesting findings of my research, because we used to live into the multilateral world, but in the context of the Southeast Asia, unilateral cooperation has proven to be much more effective. And here we're speaking about quote, maritime domain awareness increases their capabilities. Japan-Philippines agreements strengthens defense. Canada has this very, again, supports in a very niche area. The dark vessel detection helps with monitoring illegal fishing. So these were the key findings. And when it comes to the implications, the wider implications of it, the conclusions I've made is that the alliance diversification offsets specific domains of power asymmetry, deterrence for military, economic resilience for trade, and normative leverage, speaking of UNCLOS. Unilateral agility allows rapid response to ICAD tactics, but it risks ASEAN fragmentation and short-termism in Philippines decision-making, given this context. And lastly, when it comes to economic partnerships, just by the mere fact of how such agreements are drafted, there are always clauses on governance and the loans can be tricky. Basically, the implication here would be that there is such partnerships reduce this coercion vulnerability, but they impose strict regulatory conditions that can constrain Philippines' policy autonomy. And we've come to the part that is about our recommendations and to secure long-term stability that we all aim for, hopefully. Our group proposes the following 5. It's about Alexis's work highlights promotion of broader participation in UNCLOS reform discussions. She means not only states, but also not just major powers, but smaller states, as well as local organizations, for instance, fisheries, those who are directly impacted. Second policy recommendation is by Rachel regarding creating enforcement mechanisms for legally binding dispute resolutions. and she recommends more specifically UNCLOS adopting the World Trade Organization's approach. Third piece is more specific from Yuan, speaking of ASEAN's institutional reforms regarding strengthening its secretariat's mandate, funding authority, reforming the rotating chairmanship, and introducing flexible decision-making to avoid this paralysis in urgent situations. And the last two recommendations are from my side. First is when it comes to leveraging unilateral agility for maritime security, while balancing it with US Mutual Defense Treaty, US being the security guarantor who brings in this lens of the great power rivalry in this context, it's for Philippines to be careful to avoid entrapment in great power conflicts. And the second piece is when it comes to balancing economic diversification with Japan or EU, as highlighted earlier, with strategic autonomy, to be paying extra attention. The cautionary tale here is about negotiating those reciprocal terms and transparency clauses. And this brings us to the end of our presentation. Thank you very much for your attention.
All right, everyone. Thank you for your patience. Thank you for your interest. As you can see, the scope of this research has been extremely comprehensive. I cannot explain with words how proud I am of what students have done for the past few months. Now you witness that excellence, but we're not done yet. Now is the time to grill them a little bit on their knowledge and on their niche expertise. So I would like to invite questions from the audience to our group. And this time, the designated presenters can basically yield their responsibilities. They're no longer responsible to explain someone else's words. Now everyone is responsible for their own research. So before I do that, I would just also like to acknowledge that Professor Terry Hoffman is with us, the long serving director of the conflict management program, someone that has led several of these trips and whose work has inspired me in crafting ongoing trips that SAIS is doing. There is no longer a conflict management program. There are no more programs at school, but the program, the spirit of the conflict management program lives through a course such as this one and Professor Hoffman's legacy. It's quite visible in the selection of topics also that we have seen on the screen. So Terry, thank you very much for joining us. Okay, so with that, I would just like to now give the word to the audience with any questions that you might have for students, one specific or kind of casting a wide net. So whoever wants to respond. Any volunteers? I know you've heard a lot, so take some moment to digest. Hank.
Well, thank you, and congratulations on the presentations. I'll give you a chance to think about your questions specifically. What comes to mind to me is that with so much information available in libraries and on the internet and so on, and your research can be done here, you can reach out to places around the globe to get information for your projects. The question really is what difference did it make for you all to go to the Philippines? And in what ways did your trip to the Philippines change, redirect your theses, your findings, your approaches to the studies that you've done? Talking about the impact of face-to-face meetings and the experience in the Philippines. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Harry. That's a very valid question. Let's start with Matt.
I'm sure everyone in the group would love to respond, so I'll leave some opportunity for them. But for me personally, it was absolutely paramount to have the opportunity to go to the Philippines. It completely changed my perspective on things. In particular, while speakers had alluded to the term ICAT activities and the impact of that on international arbitration, the fact that every single person that we met throughout the Philippines mentioned that the term illegal, coercive, aggressive, and deceptive tactics gives them a leg up in not only international arbitration, but the maximum transparency campaign. For me, that was number one. And then the number two for me was the spirit of the people, which I, of course, knew growing up around Filipino families in Northern Virginia. However, I didn't truly appreciate that it influenced the angles that they took and the way that they approached international diplomacy. They have a personability about them. And obviously, they were showing us a lot of hospitality as visitors to their campuses and their organizations. But it makes sense when you look at their maximum transparency campaign. The Coast Guard spokesperson doesn't go up there and tell the world, look how terrible this is. They say, here's what the PRC is doing. These are the islands. Here's the track. This is how it impacted us. This is what we would like to see happen differently. And they keep it in a way that provides the PRC and the Chinese people an opportunity to back down if they were to so choose. And there is little to no xenophobia that I witnessed from the Philippine government or from any of the organizations that we met while we were there.
Should I come here?
You're more than welcome, or you can speak.
It's
from
weird,
there,
just like people on Zoom, what am I? So thank you for the question. To be honest, I was very hesitant on like, how can we address such a big topic, spending just 1 week at the Philippines?
Yeah.
And I changed my mind. It's not about, of course, we can see about our studies. There are a lot of topics, or we can go deeper in each of the topics for sure. But for me, and I have a background in journalism, it was very important to listen to the narratives and to combine where they were echoing each other or whether they were not. So this gave me tips to understand where should I pay attention or not, or how to pivot the direction or to frame better questions. This was very, very important. And of course, the approach of experiencing the country, although you cannot say, I know the country just because you spent 1 week there and just in the capital, in such a diverse country. And so spread around, but it was very interesting. Also because I had a previous experience in China. So I've heard a lot about the Chinese perspective, but I haven't crossed to the Philippines. So it was a great opportunity to contrast and compare, also to understand how much Chinese businesses were around, or even advertisement pieces on Chinese companies. I saw similar to pogos, like gambling stuff. So it changed a lot. Thank you, Professor, for putting this together.
Thank you. Anyone else would like to? Oh, yes, good.
Yeah, so I think there are two things that came to mind in terms of what shifted in my mind. And one was just being able to get a feel for domestic politics on the ground. So for context, our trip came to the Philippines the week after former President Duterte made the perhaps unwise decision to fly back to Manila and ended up in the Netherlands. And so that had affected not necessarily the content of our meetings, although we had some reschedulings because of some, again, domestic politics, some Senate hearings. But it added kind of an air to the topics that we were discussing. And I don't think we would have gotten that same kind of touch to all of our research had we not been there talking to people, whether it's in taxi rides or comparing kind of perspectives at the governmental level, although no one really references it. So it was all about our topics. And so that was kind of what it was about. The second I would say, again, on the domestic politics is the competing interests in the bureaucracy and in Congress. And so the Philippines and our various contacts would like to mention, and we saw this in person, was that whether it's governmental institutions, cultural interests in terms of pop culture or sports, the Philippines and the US share a lot of similarities, and government structures is one of them as well. And the particularities about constitutional restraint. And so for me, one of my bombshells came towards the very end of our trip. And it was, a public fact that one could find and read in the Philippine Constitution, but super relevant for military modernization and spending, is that in the Philippine 1987 Constitution, no single budgetary item can be more than education spending. So if you want to increase defense budgets, you have to increase the education budget. There's no way around it save amending the Constitution, which is, like in the United States in the current environment, in the Philippines today, a political non-starter. And any extra budgetary measures would be struck down in the courts. And so, seeing that congressional politics, budgets, and the bureaucratic competition and the different power players, I don't think we would have gotten that if we hadn't gone in person.
Elena, final thoughts on this question? You can stand there. I think the
Okay,
camera.
I think you can catch up. I'll try to project. I'm known to be quieter. Thank you very much for the question. Again, a professor highlighted it earlier as well, that all of us as students, we were not familiar with the region specifically. With conflict management, yes, but region has its nuances. From my perspective, there were also two things that stood out to me. First is as I highlighted a little bit, hinted on earlier in my presentation, when it comes to small state, that's not really appropriate towards the Philippines, a country with 110 million and over 400 billion in GDP. Yes, it is smaller than China, but it's not a small state in any other regard of other definitions that are out there in scholarly research. So again, it's so far removed from us, but in the context, it's actually, despite this big asymmetry with a giant, China, it has tools that it leads me to the second piece. It can punch above its waist. Is that the phrase in English? Yeah. Okay. So above its weight. And Philippines has been continuously capable of demonstrating it through different domains. And the meetings that we had, again, reinforced that, and they had the evidence of those effective measures that Philippines, with its limited capabilities compared to the great power or rising power as China, has accomplished. So these were two pieces I would highlight from my side.
More questions? Professor Huffman?
I just want to add, I led 2 trips to the Philippines in 2011 and 2015, when our focus was not on China, which was then a relatively minor issue, but on the civil conflict in Mindanao, in the autonomous region of Muslim Mindanao, which almost no one in the outside world knew anything about. And as indicated by the time when we lined up at Manila Airport for the once-a-day flight on Philippines Airlines to Cotabato City, and the ticket taker asked me if we really wanted to go because we'd all be killed, and offered to give us our money back. And I turned around and asked all of the SAIS students, anyone want to go? And they all said, absolutely no, we're going. And we went and we were welcomed. We spent time in the rebel camp of the Moro Islamic Liberation Front. I gave the head of the MILF a SAIS pen, and he held it up and said, the SAIS pen is mightier than the sword. So a slogan for all SAIS students, I think, to keep in mind. We went back on the second trip. We flew back with all of the leaders of the MILF for the final negotiations at that point of the peace agreement with the government, which largely then fell apart with Duterte's government, but was eventually consummated in 2021 with the creation of the Bangsamoro, the Moro Nation as an autonomous entity in the southern Philippines. But again, it was real opportunity for students to see a part of the world where almost no one from the Western world had any access to. And somehow we were not only allowed to go there, but were welcomed and treated like honored guests by both the government and by the leadership of the MILF and by a community of people who had essentially been, treated as absolute international outlaws by the vast majority of the international community. And we discovered something very, very different from that experience that I think none of us who went on that trip or either of those trips will ever forget.
All right, more questions for our group? Yes, please.
Yeah, my question is related to disinformation campaigns. So given the complexity of these various topics, in your research journey, did you encounter any situations where you had to identify disinformation campaigns? Were there any challenges for you? And were there any lessons you learned in terms of how to go about successfully identify them and identify the legitimate sources?
Can I just clarify your questions just in the kind of research
Yeah.
capacity, just challenges with identifying or classifying disinformation?
Yeah, disinformation campaigns, given, the social media, AI, weaponization of social media. And
Definitely. So first, just from a like literature perspective, it was very challenging. So in my conceptual framework, I actually went from combined a lot of different frameworks. So one, disinformation has been studied kind of in Ukraine-Russia context. So I was looking at a lot of those campaigns about identifying sources of disinformation. So a lot of that would come from research that had already been performed. And sometimes it'll even come from like a Facebook or Meta, where they were able to identify the source of a campaign, and then also kind of troll farms where there's an entire group that is kind of associated with the same like company that's paid for or same user. And so that was a way where I didn't rely necessarily on my own ability to determine exactly where disinformation was connecting, but used kind of those case studies. And then there were some specific case studies that I used from the Philippines and China as well, that had outside studies that were done. And then I think just in terms of classification too, the terminology is really important, and also recognizing that it's not there aren't like clear lines on a lot of it. So misinformation and disinformation is actually used together a lot. And that's basically, are you able to determine who's shared the information and was it intentional? So I looked at that a lot. And then I looked at the output. So I used disinformation, misinformation, and propaganda together to look at the output of, are there narratives that aren't correct or aren't factually grounded, or are trying to drive a certain perception that are used in conjunction. So that's what I used for my output for my policy recommendations. So I think all in all, what I would say is looking at different countries and how they define disinformation, how they define influence operations, and disinformation as a tool of influence operations was really helpful. And then I tried to be careful about exactly how I was looking at that. Hope that helps.
Anyone else wants to address disinformation? Different angles? All right. DC must go on.
Thank you. First of all, I just wanted to congratulate all of you for the magnificent work. I found it very insightful. And I hope you really had a great trip to the Philippines. It seems you had a very productive trip to the Philippines, and to be able to drill down on some of the topics. Maybe my question, anybody can answer. I'm coming from a perspective of somebody who works for the Philippine government. And in your presentation, all of the presentations, clearly, I saw one could see the connection between the domestic and an issue such as the South China Sea, which we actually previously discussed as well. So, for instance, when you were there, I'm sure the domestic politics is very exciting, including the impeachment. I kind of forgot when I spoke with you, was there an impeachment case already?
Not yet.
Not yet, right? So,
The day after.
and yeah, the day after. See. So clearly now, the factors that the area that you are drilling down on, disinformation, domestic politics, the stability of the government, that will have an impact a few years from now. I mean, politics aside, a few years from now on our policy vis-a-vis the South China Sea. And you have clearly shown that decisions such as whether to deepen and expand relations with the United States, an ally, that is a decision to be made by the government. And now disinformation comes in. So if anybody can answer, what should we do? I mean, and this is beyond government, actually. Somebody raised a whole of government approach. Of course, government was still, I think, in the conclusion, government should work with private sector or media to address disinformation. Because if you don't do that and it succeeds, and then there is a change in the orientation of government, that will change the policy, and we have seen that in the past, right? So anybody can answer. Second question, I think Elena was up. This is really the challenge of the trap in great power rivalry. This is, I think I mentioned to you that President Marcos has said during the Shangri-La dialogue, we have our legitimate interests in the South China Sea, but it's really difficult right now to overcome that perception that we're part of this great power rivalry. But that is a valid question. I mean, that's a valid issue. Why? Because all of their recommendation about credible deterrence, right now, it's with the United States, it's with like-minded countries. So how do we balance that? Even an issue such as attribution for cyber hacking is something that we don't have the capability right now, and then we seek assistance from the United States in having the tools to do the attribution. That's just an example. Drones is very relevant. I mean, just recently, Secretary Hegseth was there, and there was Defense Industrial Cooperation, a vision statement, and that could provide the future of cooperation. So again, but that could change, right? That could change with all the factors that you raised. So my question to anybody, especially those who did a study on disinformation, what can we do as, from a policymaker perspective? I want to hear your conclusions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, DCM Ascalon. So I'll give Maggie first the opportunity to.
Thank you so much for speaking to us prior to the trip and then also coming here and offering those wonderful comments. I can take a stab at the second question. When analyzing the transparency initiative, part of the specific goal was growing international cooperation, specifically with like-minded countries. And there's a benefit to that, as we kind of say, a mutual defense treaty. I think security-wise, there's just these joint drills with Japan and Australia, also in tandem with the United States and the Philippines. There was that critique or that missing piece of counteracting what the PRC thinks and their narrative and how they have been operating within the Philippines, as well as how they're communicating with other claimant and ASEAN nations. And I think that's a gap or a place where the government can look more into. And I know when we talked to the Department of Foreign Affairs and other folks, they were saying, it's been mainly behind the scenes because of the relationship that Vietnam or any other country has with China. And so it's not as easy for them to be transparent or for them to explicitly support the Philippines and what they're doing in the West Philippine Sea. However, I think the exploitation that China does with the perception that the Philippines is a US puppet state or whatever kind of like that narrative that you were saying, I think there's a lot that could be explored or deepened in terms of communication with ASEAN nations or specifically other claimant states and trying to combat that or explain how that narrative may be disinformation.
More comments?
Hi, thank you so much for your question. I'm going to try to answer, if I understood correctly, the first question more about what the government can do in terms of handling the domestic response to this conflict. And I think one of the key things is that the state needs to understand that the conflict is affecting different population groups very differently. And the threat that it causes is very different for different communities. So for example, obviously for some of the more financially insecure communities, the attack on the fishermen and the fisheries is a key point. For the more educated groups in Manila, the more wealthy elites, the legal dispute resonates with them maybe more strongly.
And so I think a key aspect in order to be able to kind of get a cohesive support and cohesive response to this conflict from the domestic community, the state also needs to be able to address internal divisions, because that has for a long time, I think, led the state to focus more on internal security before more recently more external security. So I think there's definitely a need to address internal divisions, internal conflicts, such as the one with the Muslim communities, before there's this ability to gain cohesive support and a unified identity also to be able to respond to the state more efficiently.
Right, more questions?
Professor, can I just
Yes, please.
I just want to add really quick timing aspect to exactly what Juliet said, is if the Philippine government can merge those two theories of how the fishermen see, how the families of the fishermen and the Philippine people see the impacts of what China's doing, they get angry, they get upset. And she's right, it's not entirely unifying to the entire country. I had a taxi driver who talked to me about how much he loved Duterte. The next taxi driver talked to me about the opposite. If you ask any of them about either the economic impacts or the impacts to fishermen getting hurt, there is a unifying theme there. And I just want to add the timing piece to that. If you think of the maximum transparency campaign only as an international piece and not the opportunity that Juliet mentioned as a unifying domestic piece, then there's like a missing link between now and that 2026 chair of ASEAN, right? When the Philippine government takes that over, there's 1 year to basically build domestic support through the maximum transparency campaign, but with a strategy focused internally to bring that momentum into the chairing of ASEAN, at which point the rest of ASEAN would witness it because they are present in the Philippines and they'll feel it.
So I just wanted to address the question on the whole of society, whole of government approach. So I compiled a number of research topics and just some different responses that other countries were working on. And so it's more of a like exploration as opposed to exactly this is what can be done. But essentially, some of the things that I found were partnering with the private sector. So actual like social media domains, working on strong community standards. I think the EU privacy laws could be an example that could be followed. And then broader, the Philippines is already doing a lot of this, so it can be examined, but working with academics on maintaining that like rigorous study, open information, freedom of the press. So there's just a lot of this like building of trust and information, which is already happening. So just capitalizing off of that. And then initiatives like Canada kind of keeps a list of disinformation threads and how to kind of fact check those, to having programs that are openly available so that citizens can learn how to identify disinformation and misinformation. All of those are examples of what can be done. And so it's a broad approach of whole of society. And then on a whole of government approach too, just as Maggie's research talked about bureaucratic politics, and every democracy kind of works on this, is who is the best suited to respond, and how can they work together but also not duplicate efforts. Hope that helps.
Just to follow up on my peers' comments, I think one thing that was relevant in my research, and also something we learned from some of the stakeholder meetings on the ground in the Philippines, was that despite the importance that we have outlined today about the issues around the South China Sea, West Philippine Sea, to much of the populace, this is around 5 to 6, fifth or sixth in terms of importance, versus poverty, economic opportunity, young people hope for the future, for example, jobs these are all more important in the eyes of the common populace. So one thing that I think is important, going off of Lindsay's point, is strengthening the domestic economic prospects of citizens is, I think, a key foundation towards policy continuity and national security. Personally, I believe, after conducting all this research, that this is pretty paramount. And I think that is the sort of foundation for which all the other mechanisms can be built.
Final thoughts?
If I can bring a brief comment to that, with my experience as a journalist, also dealing with misinformation, disinformation, while covering the politics in my country, I think one of the challenges for governments everywhere is not to do the same. That is, in order to build a narrative, to build a country, the government needs to be very precise and accurate on how to communicate and to separate what is the perception, what is important to the state, to partisans. So this is something that happens everywhere. To resist misinformation and disinformation, sometimes some governments start to create their own narratives that are not quite precise. I'm not saying that is the case of the Philippines, because I didn't do the research properly on the case, but in general, this is what my perception. And another comment, I don't know how you're applying or studying the case of Taiwan, because I guess Taiwan, it's also in the region, too close to China, and they are also victim on lots of mis and disinformation from China. And in the case, of course, they shared the language, so another layer of that. But I guess they created a very interesting model of governance on creating a department, a ministry to address this issue. And they have invested a lot on education. This is long-term investment too. So they were not addressing the question just on specific cases, but they are understanding from now to the future, we're going to deal a lot with this. So this is not momentaneous, so this should be permanent. I think these are the perceptions they could learn from other experiences. I hope it helps.
So, back. Do it manually. All right. Technology disappoints, but students don't. Before I close, I just wanted to acknowledge also the indispensable work of our TA for the group, Ananya, who is here with us. Indispensable. She was fundamental for the success of the trip. So I just want to thank you personally for all the hard work, and I know that the students benefited from your skills and patience throughout the trip. I would also like to acknowledge our contacts in the Philippines. Hopefully they will see the recording of this. The time difference doesn't really allow for a smooth presence online because it's a 12-hour difference. But especially Dr. Borromeo and his PTC holding, who have been genuinely kind in spearheading this to complete success. Together with Restituto Padilla, who was very fundamental in securing some of our meetings, we could not have done it without them. So, that speaks highly of the importance of the private sector and the non-state actors on the ground with whom we had ample engagement. For those of you who are attending this type of event for the first time, this is an invitation to consider this as your capstone opportunity for the next year, especially for the first year students. I know many of the members of present group attended the previous year's presentation, and it was a nudge to understand the value of looking at crises around the world from a conflict management perspective. It's a unique perspective, it's a very valuable perspective, and it's an enriching perspective. And I look forward to continued conversation on this topic with students at SAIS. For what is worth, I'm very glad that we can close this chapter for the current group. I want to wish them the best of luck and success after graduating now from SAIS. They have completed the requirement for the capstone now, but they now still have the finals. So let's give them a round of applause. It's the and looking forward to continuing and staying in touch. I would like to also thank the group, the club that has secured some catering for us to celebrate the success of our group. Thank you again.